The island was supposed to be deserted, or at least, that was the assumption. Shimizu Kento had earned a significant amount of money and used it to purchase the island. He had moved there alone, intending to escape the crowds. That was the plan, until he discovered an unconscious girl with pointed ears. At first, Kento wiped his face, wondering if he was imagining things, but he soon realized the girl was real. Concerned that she might be entangled in something dangerous, he also couldn't help but notice her pointed ears. After briefly admiring her appearance, he quickly returned to his senses and approached her to see if she was all right. In a weak voice, the girl apologized and asked for water. Kento immediately got up and rushed to fetch a bottle. Once back, he helped her sit up so she could drink, supporting her until she was able to drink on her own. After she finished, Kento asked whether she could understand what he was saying and if she was feeling calmer. She nodded in response and thanked him for the water, which made Kento let out a sigh of relief. He then inquired about her presence on the island. Looking away, she replied that she didn't know and that the place was unfamiliar to her. Since the island was uninhabited and located in Japan, Kento asked if she was aware of that. Nervously, she admitted that she had never heard those words before and asked who he was. Kento introduced himself as someone living on the island and asked for her name. She replied that she was Elise and identified herself as an elf. With introductions complete, Kento asked how she had arrived there, and Elise explained that she had blacked out after reaching the final floor of a dungeon. She added that when she came to, she found herself on the island. After walking along the shoreline and finding nothing, she eventually collapsed from fatigue. Curious, Kento asked about the dungeon, and she described it as a labyrinth teeming with monsters, located underground. The monsters would kill anything that entered and absorb their energy to recover. Elise explained that by defeating these creatures, one could acquire items called magic stones. This gave rise to a profession known as hunters, and she was one of them. Kento, pondering her words, commented that such things didn't exist in his world, which shocked Elise as she realized the kind of place she had ended up in. He then pointed out that standing around while talking wasn't the best idea and suggested they move somewhere more comfortable to continue the conversation. Kento asked if she was able to walk, and Elise replied that she wasn't hurt, so she could at least move by herself. She then got dressed, and as she did, Kento looked at her, which puzzled Elise, prompting her to ask if something was on her face. He quickly denied it. He explained that he was simply relieved she appeared to be okay, which put his mind at ease. Kento informed her that his house wasn't far, they just needed to walk a short distance, and he would guide her there. After walking for a bit, despite Elise growing weary, Kento finally showed her his house, nestled among some trees along the beach. He welcomed her into his home, and Elise commented that, for a house located deep in the wilderness, she had imagined something quite different, but it turned out to be far better than she had expected. Kento chuckled at her remark, saying he personally liked that kind of home, and that she was free to be honest with her thoughts. Smiling, Elise asked if that was really okay, as she wouldn't hold back, and Kento laughed, replying that he preferred that over her being afraid of him. Now that she was there, it would be impolite not to offer her something to eat, so he said he would cook and asked her to take a seat while she waited. When Elise tasted the meal, she was thrilled. It was delicious. She said it was the first time she had eaten bread that was so soft. In her world, bread tended to be dark, hard, and stale. Kento realized then that both the culture and everything from her world must be entirely different. On that note, he brought up that he had seen her carrying a bow, though without any arrows. Elise explained that she used magic to create arrows, which was why she didn't carry any with her. Kento thought about that and asked if a human like him could also use that kind of magic. Elise responded that there probably wouldn't be any issue with it. Kento laughed, saying he'd like to know how it worked, and she told him she didn't mind showing him how it functioned if he was interested. Elise then stood up and created a magical arrow right in front of Kento, placing it on the table. He was visibly surprised and asked whether it was just an illusion. She assured him it was real and said that as long as a person had mana in their body, it was possible. For some reason, she added, this world also had mana. Kento was stunned to hear that, but gradually began to make sense of the situation, and then asked her for a favor. He said he wouldn't mind if Elise stayed there for some time, but in return, He wanted to learn a bit of magic. ᴄᴏᴘᴘ answered that she didn't mind at all, but she wanted to confirm if it was really alright for her to just live there, especially since he had already helped her a lot. Kento replied that if it meant he could become the world's first mage, then it was more than worth it. He guessed she must be tired as well, so he said he would get a bath ready for her. Later, while preparing the fireplace inside the house, Kento was still struggling to believe he had met someone from another world in his own. The situation felt completely unreal. Once everything was ready, he returned to let ᴄᴏᴘᴘ know. She remarked that he had taken a long time, and he explained that, since the island was far from any cities, the bath had to be heated manually, and he also needed to draw water from the well. In appreciation, ᴄᴏᴘᴘ offered to help by fetching water the next day, which made Kento happy. ᴄᴏᴘᴘ had already done that kind of work many times in her own world, so it was nothing new to her, and Kento thanked her for the kind gesture. He then told her that once she got to the changing area, she could take off her clothes and enter the bath. ᴄᴏᴘᴘ was surprised at how large the space was for someone living alone, but she started undressing anyway. Kento quickly turned around and covered his face, shouting and asking why she was undressing right there. Casually, ᴄᴏᴘᴘ replied that she was going to take a bath, but Kento insisted that she should only do that when he wasn't looking. Putting that aside, he explained to her how to use shampoo for her hair and soap for her body, and how to operate the lever to get hot water. The water came from a tank, so he asked her not to use too much. ᴄᴏᴘᴘ remarked that he really had all the proper items for bathing, but agreed with what he said. So, ᴄᴏᴘᴘ began her bath and picked up the items provided, but she wasn't sure which one was which, since in her world, using such products wasn't common. Because of that, she called out to Kento. When he came to check what was wrong, he froze the moment he saw that she was still undressed. Covering his face, he asked why she was stepping out of the bathroom like that, and she answered that it was because she didn't know how to use the shampoo. Kento asked her to wrap herself in a towel, and then demonstrated how to press the bottle until the liquid came out. Still, despite being in the middle of teaching her, Kento felt extremely tense due to how close she was, and he hurried out soon after. ᴄᴏᴘᴘ, not fully understanding why, simply thanked him for the explanation, while Kento sighed on the other side of the door, finding the whole situation hard to believe. Eventually, ᴄᴏᴘᴘ entered the bathtub and softly commented that the water was quite hot, though she seemed to be enjoying the bath nonetheless. Later on, she came out of the bathroom and thanked him, saying that the bath had been very refreshing. Kento asked whether she had liked it, and she agreed, saying it felt really good. He then asked her to come with him so he could show her the bedroom, which once again left ᴄᴏᴘᴘ surprised. Not only was the bathroom large, the bedroom was also spacious. Kento mentioned that his own room was located on the opposite side of the hallway. That way, if anything happened, she could call for him if she needed to. After that, he left, and the two of them spent the night sleeping in separate rooms. The following morning, ᴄᴏᴘᴘ was still trying to come to terms with the fact that she had truly arrived in another world. She went downstairs to greet Kento, who asked her if she had slept well. She responded that she slept like a rock, which made him feel relieved. He mentioned he was planning to fetch water after breakfast and offered her a cup of coffee. ᴄᴏᴘᴘ asked if the well was nearby, and Kento told her it was located behind the house. However, as expected, his clothes were too big for an elf like her. Regardless, the two of them went to the well, and Kento explained that she could draw water using the pump. He told her that if she moved the lever, the water would start flowing. When ᴄᴏᴘᴘ tried it out, she was amazed that it actually worked, but in the process, she slipped and got wet. Seeing this, Kento rushed over to check if she was okay and helped her up, somewhat surprised by her clumsiness despite everything. He then suggested she take a bath so she wouldn't catch a cold from staying wet. Meanwhile, Kento was planning to go shopping in the capital. After all, ᴄᴏᴘᴘ had come from a different world and would need many essential items. Kento himself had been thrown off by the situations ᴄᴏᴘᴘ found herself in, though she seemed unaware of any of it or simply didn't care. He told her that the towel was in the same place as before, and once again, ᴄᴏᴘᴘ began undressing in front of him. Kento immediately rushed out of the house, leaving her in charge while he was away. To properly deal with everything, he needed to buy her clothes. Whenever he needed something, he would go to the capital, for which he had acquired a boat. Still, he never imagined he would one day be using that boat just to buy clothing. Then he remembered, he also needed to buy underwear. Back at home, Elise opened the refrigerator and was surprised to find that things inside actually stayed cold. She also tried using the hairdryer, excited to discover that there were all kinds of useful technologies in this world. It truly was a completely different place. Sitting in the living room, Elise thought about all the new things she needed to learn and remember here, smiling as she did. She wondered where Kento might be at the moment and decided it was time to get dressed, so she wouldn't remain in that state any longer. Meanwhile, Kento was struggling. He had gone through quite an ordeal, dealing with the embarrassment of buying clothes for Elise and being judged from every direction. Later that day, when he finally returned home looking completely worn out, Elise came to greet him and noticed that he had bought a lot of items. Most of the items Kento had brought back were meant for Elise. Since he wasn't sure what her preferences were, he thought they could go through everything together to make sure. As she began trying on the clothes, Elise asked if all the clothing in this world was this form-fitting. Kento replied that he didn't really know much about women's fashion. Elise seemed surprised because, in her opinion, considerations like that should be made when choosing what to wear. She picked up the bag containing the underwear and asked what it was, prompting Kento to grab her by the shoulders and tell her not to touch it. However, during that moment, through some strange stroke of luck, she tripped, causing Kento to fall on top of her. He immediately jumped back and apologized. He quickly asked if she was all right, and Elise nodded silently, her expression unchanged. Kento then explained that the bag contained underwear for her to wear, and that she should look through it once she was back in her room. Along with the clothes, Kento had also brought some books and planned to teach her how to read the rest of the language later on. But Elise was just staring at him, while he questioned whether he really deserved everything that had been happening. Kento reminded her that, just as he had said before, she was also returning the favor by teaching him magic, so in the end, things were balanced. He added that if he really could become the world's first mage, that would be incredible. And if Elise wanted to stay there for good, he wouldn't have a problem with it. After all, he enjoyed having someone to talk to. Elise laughed, commenting that he really did seem to be in a good mood. That settled it. Kento then said he would go prepare something to eat, and in the meantime, she could head upstairs and try on the underwear. Elise agreed and went to her room to examine the underwear of this world, quickly realizing that it actually fit her perfectly. Suddenly, she called out to Kento and ran to him, full of excitement, though he had no idea why. Elise was clearly thrilled, exclaiming how amazing this thing called science was. She asked how people had figured out the composition of air, or how they discovered something called gravity. She was eager to learn all about these unfamiliar concepts. The more she found out, the more the history of this world amazed her. That was when she noticed that Kento was looking at her, and he laughed, saying that she reminded him of a child when she got excited like that. Elise looked a little embarrassed, and Kento quickly tried to justify himself, but she didn't seem to mind at all and simply agreed with him. After all, experiencing all of this for the first time made her feel like a curious child again. She hadn't seen much outside of the island, but just thinking about how much more there was to discover filled her with happiness. Kento agreed with her and suggested that next time, they could go together. There was so much more for her to explore. Elise asked with excitement if they really could do that, while Kento, in turn, was relying on her to teach him magic. Later on, the protagonist went out to tend to the crops, checking to make sure there were no insects. Everything appeared to be in perfect condition. Elise remarked that he seemed to be enjoying himself, and he replied that he had always liked doing things by himself since childhood. To Elise, it wasn't clear how that could be fun. Maybe it was something she'd have to try for herself before judging. She walked over to him and asked if he could teach her how he did it because she wanted to learn about agriculture in this world. Besides, Elise added that she couldn't let him have all the fun alone. Kento gestured that he could manage on his own and claimed he wasn't exactly a master at teaching. Even so, Elise insisted that it was fine. He still knew much more than she did. That was when Kento noticed just how determined she really was. That was the point he had wanted to make, but it wasn't something they could just jump into. First, she needed to check that the plants were in good health. By watching them grow through her own efforts and care, She might begin to understand why Kento found it so enjoyable. Elise thought about it and admitted that it was true. She wouldn't be able to do it instantly. So, she chose one plant to take care of personally. Kento agreed and reminded her not to give up midway, and Elise, slightly annoyed, reminded him that she wasn't a child and promised to care for it until the very end. Kento found it amusing to watch Elise's expressions change like that. Later on, during his magic lessons, Elise explained that there was a type of magic used to enchant objects, enhancing their performance. Other forms of magic could transform into elemental forces like fire or water, and there was also a type used to summon things, such as magical arrows. What all these types of magic had in common was the requirement to release mana independently from the body. The first step was to check whether Kento had an invisible compartment within him that could be used to store mana, so she asked him to stay still. Eventually, Elise congratulated him. He had a visible compartment, which meant he was capable of using magic. As long as he had that, he could circulate mana throughout his body. From there, it was just a matter of directing the flow to specific points. Doing so would enhance his physical capabilities. Elise then demonstrated by performing an enormous jump using mana. Kento was completely shocked by this. Elise told him that if he focused the mana in his arms or legs, he could do the same. Normally, that would drastically increase one's physical strength. To help him visualize it, she guided him to imagine mana moving through his veins, like blood. She moved behind him to assist, telling him to relax and picture himself moving his limbs. But then Elise asked what was wrong, because Kento had suddenly stopped. He explained that maybe they were standing a bit too close. She apologized and asked if that made him uncomfortable. Kento clarified that it wasn't that, he was just a little nervous being that near. Regardless, Elise continued, encouraging him to at least try once and see the result. Kento agreed, saying he would attempt it now, but asked her to step back a little first. When he finally tried, Kento was taken completely off guard. He had actually done it. But during the jump, he hit his head on a branch and fell. Elise ran over and asked if he was okay, and Kento laughed, surprised that he could jump so high on his very first try. Elise noted that with time and repeated use, he would naturally learn how to control his enhanced abilities. His invisible compartment must be fairly large, considering how powerful his first attempt was. Kento asked if that was a good thing, and Elise explained that the larger the compartment, the more mana it could store for future use. That meant in time, he would be able to cast much stronger spells for longer durations. In other words, he had great potential. Kento started to feel like he was beginning to understand what magic really was. Using mana didn't seem as hard as he first thought. Elise told him that now that he could release mana, they would eventually need to adjust his training depending on the type of mana he had. She would help with that, so he should try using mana for a variety of tasks throughout the day. She had been worried that he might not be able to synchronize his breathing with mana release. However, since the house was surrounded by mana, that wouldn't be an issue. When Elise thought about how much mana was present and how she ended up in that location, she began to suspect that there might be a dungeon nearby. Kento asked if that was dangerous, given that dungeons usually contained monsters, and Elise answered that monsters normally couldn't leave the dungeon. Still, Elise felt compelled to go and check it out. In the meantime, Kento should stay focused on his training. With no good counterargument, the protagonist agreed, and she told him she would scout the area. Elise went to patrol the island, and as expected, even after searching thoroughly, she was only able to cover part of the area. The strongest concentration of mana was in that region, and it didn't take long before she discovered what looked like a dungeon entrance. At first, she assumed it was just a small cave, but it turned out to be part of an extensive system. It was highly unusual for a dungeon to exist in this world. If there were demons inside, it could lead to serious problems. Suddenly, Elise noticed a glow. The dungeon was producing an immense amount of magical energy. It was both miraculous and dangerous. Acting quickly, she created a seal and closed off the entrance, believing that things would be fine as long as the seal held. Meanwhile, Kento continued his training, beginning to grasp how mana flowed through the body. Elise returned and asked how it was going. Kento said he was steadily improving, and she told him that, just as she had suspected earlier, there really was a dungeon nearby. Kento took that as a sign that he should step up his training. Still, Alice reassured him that there was no need to worry just yet. Nothing would happen with the dungeon for now. However, they would need to come up with a plan, because the presence of a dungeon could have unpredictable consequences in this world. Even so, Alice wasn't going to let Kento push himself too hard. For the time being, she told him to stay away from the dungeon. Kento asked if it was possible for him to go inside, and Alice warned him that she wasn't sure what might happen. It was certainly possible, but she didn't recommend it. Kento wanted to understand the situation better, especially since he had recently purchased the island. Alice said she understood and promised to take him there once he had gained more experience with magic. Some monsters could emerge from things like trees or rocks, and since the island had plenty of both, there was always a risk. She had sealed the entrance to the cave, but that would only serve as a temporary barrier. Then, Alice handed Kento a piece of paper. It was a list of items they would need in order to explore the dungeon. She intended to have him buy those supplies during his next trip to the mainland. There was a limit to how far they could progress inside a dungeon, even with magic, so having the proper tools would be necessary. Kento agreed, realizing that they wouldn't find those things just by staying on the island. Still, it worked out well. He had already planned to take his boat in for maintenance, and since that would take a full day, he suggested they go together. Alice asked if that would be all right, pointing out that an elf might attract too much attention, so Kento gave her a hat. He had bought it previously for the specific purpose of hiding her ears, and he asked her to try it on and see if she liked it. When Alice put the hat on, Kento complimented her, saying it looked great. She was genuinely happy, especially knowing he had even picked out clothes for her. Kento explained that he had chosen the clothes with the thought that, someday, she might go out with him. While Alice was distracted in her happiness, he asked her to help him with the preparations. Kento could tell how excited she was, but he knew she would discover even more incredible things over time. Alice agreed. She was looking forward to all of it. There was still so much she didn't know, so she had to keep learning. From that point on, Alice continued trying on clothes and studying, using a tablet Kento gave her to look at different outfits and to learn. She kept experimenting until she came across a piece of underwear that she didn't understand how to wear. It had been in the bag, so she assumed she was supposed to put it on underneath her clothing. Even after examining it for a while, Alice still didn't know its purpose. She decided to ask Kento about it the next day. For now, she was far too excited to worry about something as minor as clothing. The next morning, Alice came downstairs and remarked, as usual, that he always woke up early. Kento replied that it had become a habit. Since there was no one else on the island to help him, he was used to waking up early and doing everything alone. Laughing, Alice joked that no one was going to make his breakfast for him, but she also said that the food in this world was always delicious. Kento told her that even the vegetables they were growing could be turned into delicious meals, which caught her attention. He promised that one day he'd teach her how to cook, but first, they needed to focus on their plans for the day. Kento was thinking of taking Alice on a walk around the main island. After that, they could drop off the boat for repairs and visit some of the places she was interested in. Alice was so excited that she could barely contain it, but before they left, he asked her to help by fetching water from the well. She still hadn't gotten used to using magic for such tasks, and that was when Kento suddenly froze. Alice had caught his attention. She wasn't wearing any underwear to cover her chest, and she asked if that was the item she hadn't known how to wear. She had planned to ask him how to put it on, but even so, he asked her not to do things like that in front of him. Kento told her to wait in her room while he handled everything else, sighing heavily as he sat down, practically forcing her out of the kitchen. He was constantly looking at her like that. It wouldn't hurt if she tried to imagine things from his perspective now and then, but that didn't seem to occur to her. Eventually, after trying for a while, Alice successfully figured out how to wear the underwear. Then the two of them went out together to collect water. Alice asked if he usually fetched water like that, and Kento responded that there should still be enough for now, but since their usage had increased, he was making more trips than before. All the water they used came from a tank located behind the house. The system stored electricity and charged batteries using solar panels and wind power. There wasn't any gas available on the island, so they relied on electricity for heating water and cooking. Meanwhile, Elise wasn't sure what to do. She couldn't decide where they should go first. That's when Kento asked if he could come in. He wanted to know if she was ready so they could leave. When she was prepared, Elise came out and met Kento, apologizing for making him wait. But it turned out to be worth it. She looked stunning in ordinary clothes. With her ears hidden, she resembled a foreigner. Everything looked good on her. With that, Kento said it was time to go, and Elise mentioned that she would like to see the architecture of this world. Since they were heading to the main island, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. Kento agreed, saying that seeing it in person would be very different from just reading about it. He also hoped they'd be able to find the equipment for exploring the dungeon, but they could think about that later and enjoy the trip for now. When they arrived at the boat, Elise was clearly amazed. Kento offered to let her stay up on the deck if she liked, though it was a bit cluttered. But before he could finish, she interrupted him and asked to see everything inside. He told her she could walk around as she pleased. Elise thanked him and eagerly ran off to explore the runes scattered throughout the ship. She was very impressed. Even though it was just a boat, the runes here were far more advanced than those from her world. Kento asked if she had already seen everything, and Elise replied that she had. Being able to travel comfortably while admiring the beauty of the ocean was something she had never imagined possible back in her world. Kento asked if she had ever traveled by boat in her previous world, and she explained that the seas were ruled by monsters there. Even if someone wanted to sail, it wasn't an option. They didn't have the technology to build vessels of this size, and very few people had the courage to even attempt sea travel. Elise had already encountered so many surprises in this new world, and it seemed like there were still many more ahead. Then Kento mentioned that they'd be riding in a car once they got to the port, so more surprises were coming. Elise excitedly asked if he was referring to the vehicles that moved through the cities, and he confirmed it. It was clear that she really wanted to see a car. She was thrilled, and so they continued their journey until they reached the port, where she noticed how busy and crowded the area was. Kento explained that it was because this beach area was commonly used for boats and marine sports. It was probably nothing like what she had pictured. Still, it was completely different from anything she was used to. And since there were no monsters in the water here, she could swim without being afraid. Kento admitted that he felt a bit envious. In her world, not being able to swim in the ocean was hard to imagine. Now he understood why Elise had just walked along the beach that day instead of swimming, because it was still a dangerous idea for her. They got into a car. Elise had seen cars on TV before, but riding in one was an entirely new experience. She asked if he couldn't go any faster. Kento laughed and explained that unfortunately, this was as fast as he could legally drive. She was a little disappointed, but then decided to take off her hat for a bit and enjoy the view through the window. Aside from her pointed ears, she looked just like anyone else in this world. However, the differences in mindset and culture were significant. This world was truly a completely different place, and they eventually arrived at what, in his world, would be considered a grand castle. Kento told her that this particular one had been built long ago. Elise didn't know much about this world yet, but the construction style of the buildings gave her a sense of comfort. In her original world, the technology had barely advanced beyond what was available when the temples were constructed, and Kento realized that meant it was about on par with Japan's Edo period. If more elves ever found themselves in this world, they would undoubtedly be stunned before long. As they continued walking together, Elise's hat suddenly blew off, but Kento quickly chased it down and placed it back on her head. He asked if she was all right, and she nodded. Since everything happened so suddenly, no one should have seen her ears. For now, they decided to head back, and Kento felt relieved that no one seemed to notice what had happened or paid any special attention. Elise apologized for not realizing that her hat had flown off. She must have been too distracted by her surroundings. The truth was, Kento had wanted to go out and buy the tools for exploring the dungeon, but he figured they could just leave that for the next day. She replied that there was no need to rush. She had really enjoyed the day, so she was satisfied. Kento was glad to hear that the outing had been worth it. He said goodnight and returned to his room, reminding her that she could call him if she needed anything. Elise decided to take a bath first, and afterward, she went back to her room, lay down, and went to sleep. The next day, the two of them went out shopping, and ᴄᴏᴘ became completely fixated on something called pudding that she saw in the store. The protagonist laughed as she got excited over those kinds of things, and they ended up buying everything that caught her attention. ᴄᴏᴘ began to feel concerned because it seemed like they had bought too much, but Kento told her it was fine, they'd have enough desserts to last a while. The only thing missing now was the gear they needed for the dungeon. They could head to a hardware store to look for it. ᴄᴏᴘ asked if they'd really be able to find everything they needed there, and Kento replied that it was very likely. When they got to the hardware store, ᴄᴏᴘ was amazed at how many different types of things were for sale and asked what kind of store it was. Kento explained that it was a place that sold all kinds of useful items for everyday life. She found a sheet of metal that was pretty small, but Kento told her they could probably find a bigger one somewhere else, as he doubted a store like that would carry larger ones. Still, ᴄᴏᴘ said they might as well take it. There was no need to go searching all over. She also picked up an axe, since the sheet was too small and they needed something that could offer more reach. There didn't seem to be anything else they needed. ᴄᴏᴘ realized that, after all, it wasn't a weapon store. As they were leaving, she misstepped and Kento caught her just in time. She thanked him for helping, but he turned his eyes away. After all, she had ended up in an awkward position, and he told her not to worry about it. But ᴄᴏᴘ moved even closer, asking if he was okay. That only made the situation more uncomfortable for Kento, and he finally decided that they might as well wrap things up and rely on what they had. They also grabbed some protective construction equipment, gloves, helmets, and boots. There was no guarantee it would all fit properly, but it was better to be cautious. They could also grab some food, maybe canned goods or something similar. Anything would do, as long as they had something to eat. As long as they had food, the only thing left was to master magic, and they'd be able to go in and out of the dungeon safely. Kento planned to return the car when they got back to the port, so he told ᴄᴏᴘ she could rest for now. She agreed, since she was feeling a bit tired. Kento had expected that, considering they'd done quite a bit of walking. A little while later, the protagonist came back only to find ᴄᴏᴘ fast asleep. That made him smile as he decided that it was time for them to head home. Once back, ᴄᴏᴘ was in the middle of undressing when she called out to Kento, asking him to come over because she couldn't manage to get dressed by herself and needed help. Once again, Kento found himself in an awkward situation. Although ᴄᴏᴘ didn't seem to understand his reactions, he ended up agreeing to help. She was trying to cover herself more, which probably meant that she was getting more accustomed to the clothing customs of this world. So Kento helped her get dressed and asked if everything was tied up correctly. ᴄᴏᴘ thanked him, saying it was good enough. A little while later she was finally ready, and the protagonist smiled, feeling a sense of nostalgia from seeing those clothes again. ᴄᴏᴘ said she wanted to avoid getting her usual clothes dirty, so she figured it would be better to wear those for now while getting ready. Apparently, she couldn't wear underwear with the outfit she had chosen for going into the dungeon, so she decided to leave it off for now. ᴄᴏᴘ said it was easier to move in something she was already used to, so they could go ahead and proceed toward the dungeon. When they got to the place, Kento noticed that the entrance looked quite different from how she had described it. ᴄᴏᴘ had made some modifications the last time she visited. Since then, the dungeon had been radiating a significant amount of mana. Kento asked what the items she brought were for, and ᴄᴏᴘ explained they were a first aid kit to treat any injuries they might suffer. She added that this was also a good spot to rest if needed. The injuries would have to be minor for the kit to be effective. Kento chuckled because she always said such odd things, but if they got seriously hurt, she showed him they had potions. Those were the only potions they had. Since ᴄᴏᴘ couldn't create more, they should only be used in life or death circumstances. Still, having potions didn't mean they could lower their guard. Kento thanked her for being cautious, but reminded her the potions belonged to her, so she should decide when to use them. ᴄᴏᴘ had no intention of abandoning an ally. It was for both of their sakes. Since she had gone to the trouble of saying all this, he promised he'd stay vigilant. She also said that if something dangerous happened, she would do her best to protect him. Hearing that was better than anything to Kento, as ᴄᴏᴘ wanted to avoid using potions unless absolutely necessary. The two then entered the dungeon. Kento remarked that at first glance, it just looked like an ordinary cave, but there was definitely a different atmosphere inside. ᴄᴏᴘᴘ said that was to be expected since it was his first time being surrounded by so much mana. Besides, a cave with light at the end was unusual. Artificial dungeons like this had lights inside. They could follow the lights without needing to carry their own. The presence of lights meant the dungeon was deep, so ᴄᴏᴘᴘ told Kento to stay behind her and talk less. This way, they could at least keep the element of surprise, to which Kento agreed. Even though he had entered full of anticipation, her warning made him a little nervous. After walking for some time, ᴄᴏᴘᴘ said they must be quite deep now, but Kento still hadn't seen any monsters. It felt like they were simply exploring a regular cave. Monsters only appeared at the depths, where the mana was denser. Oddly enough, he was kind of disappointed. Suddenly, ᴄᴏᴘᴘ signaled for him to stop and stay alert. A wooden mannequin appeared, and she explained it was a puppet-type monster, so Kento could handle it. He had already seen the results of his training and could fight it without trouble. Kento agreed they should take action. ᴄᴏᴘᴘ said she would handle the monster if he failed. He hadn't been seen in action yet. That was all she said, but to his surprise, the puppet monster immediately noticed him. It was surprisingly agile for a mere doll. Suddenly, ᴄᴏᴘᴘ shouted his name, and he quickly launched an attack. At that moment, the puppet fell, and Kento sighed in relief. ᴄᴏᴘᴘ praised him for reacting swiftly despite making a mistake. It was a good chance to learn how to fight even after errors. He'd have to be prepared for such situations from now on. Kento wished he'd been warned earlier, and then a small stone appeared, which ᴄᴏᴘᴘ crouched to pick up. Kento asked what it was, and she explained it was the crystal a monster leaves behind after defeat. The stronger the monster, the more beautiful and valuable the crystal. Such crystals didn't exist in Kento's world, so to him, it was just a glowing rock. Suddenly, ᴄᴏᴘᴘ noticed something and pointed for Kento to look. It was the same smoke that appeared when the monster vanished earlier. When monsters died, they were covered in black mist until they revived, so Kento reached out his hand. But ᴄᴏᴘᴘ stopped him, saying it was fine. She could handle it, since they didn't know what might happen. To Kento's surprise, the puppet reappeared. But this time, it had a different weapon. The puppet monster still carried the same crossbow as before, but each of them had a unique weapon. ᴄᴏᴘᴘ said Kento was unlucky and quickly shot an arrow that killed it instantly. They were fortunate to obtain a weapon this early, and Kento realized that monsters' weapons remained even after the creatures were defeated. Having already collected quite a few items, ᴄᴏᴘᴘ suggested they head back before they encountered more monsters. But suddenly, Kento collapsed, and ᴄᴏᴘᴘ caught him, asking what was wrong. He apologized, explaining his vision had blurred. He couldn't see anything. Feeling exhausted, Kento said he would be fine after resting, but he practically passed out on the spot. Worried, ᴄᴏᴘᴘ knelt beside him and noticed he had developed a fever, shouting for him to wake up while trying to help. After laying him down, ᴄᴏᴘᴘ quickly realized Kento's rapid illness was due to his body not being used to exposure to so much mana before entering the dungeon. Kento tried to sit up, saying he needed to prepare breakfast, but ᴄᴏᴘᴘ pushed him back down, insisting he stay still while she prepared something. She even left a bottle of water nearby for him. As Kento thanked her, she decided to go out and get some food for him. He apologized for causing her so much trouble, but ᴄᴏᴘᴘ said it was fine. Helping friends was normal. Kento smiled, realizing they truly were friends. But deep down, ᴄᴏᴘᴘ wasn't doing this just for him. She thought any friend would do the same and paused to reflect on why it made her so happy. It had been a long time since she'd made a new friend. A little later, she returned, apologizing for the delay and asking if peaches would be okay for him to eat. Kento agreed and thanked her. Noticing something, she asked if he was okay and whether he could eat by himself. Kento said moments like this were exactly when someone should be fed since he couldn't move to do it himself. Laughing, ᴄᴏᴘᴘ teased if his mother had been so caring that she wouldn't even let him eat on his own. Feeling flustered, Kento sat up, insisting he could manage and said he'd set the bowl aside once he finished eating. Later, ᴄᴏᴘᴘ came back to check on the protagonist, and he simply nodded before drifting off to sleep again. When he woke up, he asked if she had stayed there the entire time, and she replied that she had only just returned since he hadn't woken up earlier. He answered that it had been a long while since someone had taken care of him. Because of that, he ended up sleeping very peacefully. Elise told him he didn't have to respond if he didn't want to, but she still asked why he had chosen to live on such a deserted island by himself. Surely, it couldn't have been just for money. She mentioned that no matter how much money she had, she would never move to a place like that. Kento paused to think, saying that it wasn't an interesting story. Then he explained that before moving he had worked as a teacher. He hadn't had much money and lived a rather ordinary life. But he ran into trouble with one of his students. Remaining there became difficult, so after he had managed to earn a large amount of money, he left and moved far away to escape. Still, Kento muttered that it was a foolish story and told her she could simply forget about it. Even so, Elise asked if there hadn't been anyone who could help him, or if he had just endured it all on his own before moving to the island. That sounded odd to her, and Kento asked what was wrong. Snapping out of her thoughts, the elf apologized, saying she was just trying to understand why it all happened and ended up saying unnecessary things. Still, Kento told her that he didn't mind. After all, he was living there precisely because of what had happened. Elise remarked that living there was still unusual, but he replied that it was because of that choice that he was able to meet her. Rather than clinging to the past, Kento wanted to focus on the life he now had, and as he said this, he took her hand. Smiling, Elise said she understood and once again apologized for raising such a sensitive subject while he was unwell. All of a sudden, something dropped, and the protagonist realized he had forgotten to ask her about the magic stone. She explained that she had been trying to discover a purpose for it. It seemed it could be turned into accessories or similar items. Hearing this, Kento understood it was something crafted by hand. She also had her own magic stone, so if possible, she wanted the two of them to work together on creating something. The protagonist agreed that it was definitely something they could do, as long as they had the necessary materials. This made Elise excited, since she had secretly wanted to get a hair clip for a while. In return, Kento wanted to make a shoulder bag to carry his belongings. Then, she moved closer to show him something. It was news about strange ruins that had appeared in Shinjuku. Alongside man-made structures, ruins had emerged in that district of Tokyo. It might only be a possibility, but Elise began to imagine that beyond the island where she lived, there could be others like her. Since a dungeon had appeared on the main island, the government hadn't yet devised a plan to handle the situation. In the midst of that chaos, it was only a matter of time before they reached this island, but now the situation was becoming direct. A woman had come to speak with Kento and asked him to hand over the island, something he immediately refused. However, she continued insisting that they weren't trying to take it for free. They were willing to pay him a large amount of money to compensate for the island. He told her to wait and questioned why they wanted an island that was supposed to be empty and deserted. Other than his house, there was nothing nearby. There was nothing of value where he lived, and he had never imagined that the government would show such interest in this island. The woman answered that it was nothing official, just a personal offer. She was using her own money, with no connection to the government. Kento replied that this only made it seem even more suspicious. If the island had no value and wasn't of any official interest, he wondered how someone like her could want it. With a sigh, the woman muttered that she didn't want to explain the situation, but ultimately admitted that she could see the girl beside Kento was an elf. A photograph on the internet had sparked widespread attention. It had been taken when they had gone to the main island. It was on the day Elise had lost her hat, and so she realized that the woman had come to investigate everything. The woman admitted that normally such a thing would make her laugh, but she couldn't deny the existence of beings from another world. Moreover, since she had traveled all the way there, she had confirmed that magic truly existed on the island. It served as proof that there was a dungeon within it. Kento reasoned that if dungeons existed elsewhere, then it wouldn't be unusual for people to have the ability to use magic too. The woman then remarked that it was time for him to start paying more attention from now on. In addition, she declared that she wanted to purchase the elf together with the island. Elise immediately questioned what she meant by that, but Kento flatly rejected the idea. That was what he intended to say. Still, above all else, he wanted to respect Elise's choice. If she wished to leave the island, he had no right to hold her back. After a brief pause, Elise replied that she had no plans of leaving and politely apologized to the woman, but that was simply how things would remain. The official stood and asked if that was his refusal, and Kento confirmed that indeed it was. Yet she pressed further, wanting to know if he would hold to his decision even after she offered any amount of money he requested, sighing as she muttered that they were a foolish group. Elias responded that it wasn't like that. She explained that she just couldn't hand the place over to people she didn't trust. The woman grew irritated, remarking that beings from another world always had views entirely different from what was considered normal. It was fine that they were getting along now, but she warned they would come to regret it, which made Kento ask what she meant. The woman only cautioned them that there were other means to take possession of the island besides using money. The protagonist remarked that this was clearly a threat, but she laughed, insisting it was nothing more than a warning. Her authority, she claimed, gave her the power to do whatever she pleased with people like him. For the moment, she would allow them time to think things over. The two of them could discuss at length what they intended to do. After the government woman departed, Elias asked Kento what his plan was. They couldn't simply leave things unresolved. He answered that no matter how often the government pressed, his reply would remain unchanged. He had no desire to surrender the island. With a smile, Elias said she had been planning to practice her mana that day, but since she was in a sour mood now, she would just return home and take a bath instead. A little while later, once she finished bathing, Elias noticed the protagonist staring at the photograph the official had brought earlier. Embarrassed, he explained that he had only thought her hair looked nice, and Elias asked if it was really just her hair. That quickly made him wave his hands nervously, insisting that of course both she and her hair were beautiful. At that moment, he came up with an idea. He fastened a hairpin into Elias' hair. He had forgotten that he had crafted that hair clip for her from the magic stone. Elias was amazed, since it felt as though he had conjured it with magic, but he explained that he had discovered various uses for it online. If she memorized them, she could certainly manage it herself, and he showed her on the tablet different methods she could try once she grew accustomed to it. Beaming, she thanked him and immediately suggested they go to the beach. Even though Kento didn't understand why, since he thought she intended to train her magic, she insisted. She could always practice the next day. After what had happened with those people, she no longer felt motivated to train. Kento laughed, remarking how moody she always was, but he agreed to go to the beach, which delighted her. The two of them went together, and Elias commented that it felt like a long time since they had been there alone. She then asked if the protagonist could swim, and Kento was puzzled until he realized that she meant she couldn't. Elias responded that she had never gone into the ocean before, so naturally she didn't know how to swim. This made the protagonist reflect for a moment. Thinking it over, Elias explained that in her world, the seas were filled with dangerous beasts, so she likely would never have been able to approach the water at all. Then Kento told her to wait and asked why she was entering the water while still dressed in her normal clothes. Elias asked what the problem was, and he answered that it wasn't exactly wrong, but he had brought her a swimsuit so she could change. Taking the outfit, she asked if it was really fine for her to wear it and began to undress, which made Kento quickly stop her again. The protagonist explained that he had also brought a curtain so she could change privately, assuring her she could use it without worry. Elias sighed, saying he didn't need to go that far, but Kento insisted that he absolutely did, for many reasons. Once she finished changing, she remarked that she loved the swimsuit. It looked beautiful and gave her a sense of freedom. There was also something around her waist that was part of the swimsuit's design, which made the whole look more elegant. It seemed like a lot of effort for something that would just end up wet, but even so, the design was modest. Kento asked if she had chosen it herself, and she explained that she had wanted to experience the luxuries of this world. As thanks, she promised to teach him magic that could be used underwater, but for now, they should focus on having fun. So the two of them spent time enjoying themselves at the beach. Kento asked if the underwater magic was something monsters couldn't perform. They would still be troublesome, she replied, but yes, even a super powerful human couldn't always defeat magical beasts. There were individuals who could fight magical beasts barehanded, but no one foolish enough would ever try it. At least in Eliza's world, that was how things worked, and Kento could understand why it mattered. Since dungeons had appeared in his world, he wasn't sure if it would be the same or if exceptions might exist. There was no way to know if the ocean was the sole source of mana, but if there was enough mana, then land and sea could be no different. The protagonist asked if it was really all right for them to relax like this, and she answered that for the moment, she could only sense things coming from the island's center. That meant they were safe for now, though it was only her impression, so they shouldn't treat it as absolute. Whatever the case, Alice was there with him now. They had been together and supporting each other ever since they met. Because of that, Kento felt they should work to protect the island together. Hearing this, Alice blushed before abruptly standing up. He asked what was wrong, but she stayed quiet, and Kento thought that since their trip to the dungeon, there had been moments when she seemed distant like this. Suddenly, Alice turned her face away, and he was left uncertain about what was troubling her. That was when a knock came at the door, and once again they were confronted by the government woman, who apologized for disturbing them. Kento sighed. It was courteous of her to come all the way to such an isolated place, even though he was certain they had not scheduled a meeting. The woman stated that they already knew the reason for her visit. It was about their previous discussion. The answer, however, would remain the same no matter how many times she asked. There was no way he would give up the island, so Kento told her to leave. But she complained once more, saying that he was being unreasonable. She still wanted to resolve things the easy way, but warned that she couldn't guarantee his safety if he refused to cooperate. The government wanted to bring the dungeon issue under control, and a report had claimed that anyone unwilling to comply could become a problem. If a civilian were injured during a monster hunt, such an accident could happen, and he should understand what she meant. Kento thanked her for clarifying, but since she had gone so far as to bring up such an offensive remark, she might fail to notice the individual from another world now aiming directly at her. And of course, it was Alice pointing an arrow at the woman's head. They had an elf who had adapted to mana and was now guarding this place. Kento didn't think it was a hopeless battle. The woman remarked that it sounded threatening, but since she had recorded his words, it wasn't as though she had any evidence against him. Still, Kento insisted it was nothing more than a simple warning. As she ordered him to remain silent, her assistant remarked that it was about time they departed. But the woman insisted she couldn't return empty-handed. They also possessed magic on their side, and she couldn't afford to lose against people from another world. Alice asked if she truly believed she could win against her with such pitiful magic. If they left immediately, she might overlook their arrogance. The woman replied that if they dared lay a hand on her, it would mean becoming enemies of the state, but Alice refused to acknowledge a nation that treated its own people this way. And in the first place, Alice pointed out, she wasn't from this world, so killing her would be the simplest solution in many respects. Kento urged her to calm down, and he also asked the other woman to leave, insisting that staying like this wouldn't resolve anything. Yet she refused once more, declaring that the island should still belong to her. To her, Kento was far too stubborn for nothing more than a commoner. Finally, Alice lost her patience and launched an attack against the woman, which only enraged her further. But Alice questioned whether she ought to silence her mouth as well. She didn't intend to repeat herself, as the conversation had ended, and the woman rose to her feet, issuing threats. She couldn't possibly expect that she would just walk away like that. After they departed, Alice sighed, remarking that the government truly didn't know when to give up. Kento sighed as well, troubled because she had been close to taking their lives, though in the end Alice had not done so. Still, she understood that this matter wouldn't end anytime soon. She wanted to know what their next course of action should be. Now they had evidence of the threats. They could use it against them later. Meanwhile, a group of well-dressed women was preparing for another battle, arming themselves with guns. They had received confirmation that the island's resident could be eliminated, meaning the elf absolutely needed to be captured. So they made preparations to land on the island, having been informed that their target was merely an ordinary civilian, even though the operation was already underway. That shouldn't have mattered, as their leaders simply wanted to settle everything quickly and ensure no trace was left behind. Even the assistant questioned whether this wasn't going too far. Matters should have been resolved through negotiation, but their superior reminded them that it had been the others who had broken off talks. She said she would carve their regret into their bodies for refusing the offer, though the assistant suspected she had never intended to negotiate sincerely in the first place. Even if it would have been wiser to resolve things through dialogue before they escalated, the assistant wondered what would happen next. Meanwhile, Elise was fully aware of what was unfolding, and it seemed that threats alone would no longer be enough. Kento said he wished there were some way they could drive their enemies away, but Elise asked what exactly he meant by that. After all, he should realize that their opponents would force them to learn. They had to end it here and now, and Kento asked how she intended to accomplish that. Elise responded that she had already made her decision. It was because she had no intention of letting them leave alive, and the protagonist froze, asking if she truly meant to take their lives. Elise answered that it was only natural to reach such a conclusion. She was merely responding in kind. Even so, although Kento opposed it, Elise had already made up her mind and didn't plan to involve him. When the protagonist fell silent, she admitted she didn't like it either, but suggested that they should at least try to restrain their enemies first. If things grew too dangerous, then she would do what was necessary. Kento replied that he understood her point. Their first step would be to use the island's terrain to lure everyone into the dungeon. Suddenly, Elise loosed her arrows, drawing the attention of their enemies, though she easily avoided their attacks. Despite all the gunfire, they couldn't tell if they had even hit anything, so they ceased shooting and began pursuing the elf. When they spotted the resident mentioned in the report, they opened fire, but Kento swiftly used his ability to shield himself from the bullets. They were taken aback, realizing that he was also wielding magic, and Elise seized the chance to take the lead in subduing their opponents. Behind her, another enemy appeared, but the protagonist struck first to protect Elise, which should have been the end of it. She couldn't guarantee the safety of those girls if they acted recklessly. Unlike their incompetent superior, Elise was merciful, so they could remain calm. She wouldn't kill them. But the woman refused and attacked Kento, managing to seize Elise as well and restrain her. They struck her to render her unconscious. The woman yanked Elise by the hair, asking if she truly believed they were the only ones capable of nullifying magic. They had been ordered to bring the elf back alive, but no one had mentioned that she needed to remain unharmed, so they figured they could rough her up a little. For that reason, they wanted Kento to watch as Elise was given this so-called treatment before they finally took his life. It was time, they said, to wipe out some monsters. Elise sighed, having already been warned not to kill them, but her patience had reached its limit. With incredible speed, she slammed her opponent into the ground. After knocking her down, Elise asked if they truly believed they could win just because they had sealed her magic. Now Kento should finally understand. If they allowed these women to leave, they would only keep returning. The best way to eliminate the threat was to wipe them all out at once. At last, Kento admitted that he understood, and Elise recognized it was her moment to act. Their misfortune was in choosing to become subordinates of that government woman. The woman called Elise a monster. She warned Elise not to think she would get away with this, but Elise asked if that was all she had to say before firing arrows that struck down two of the women. Soon, only one remained. As a final message, Elise told her to return and expose all of her superior's wrongdoings. The woman questioned if Elise truly believed she would die anyway, and in desperation, she launched an attack. At that moment, Kento struck her down, sighing at how pathetic it was, though he lacked the resolve to end her life. Elise asked why he bothered then, and he answered that everything concerning this island was their shared problem. He couldn't just leave all the responsibility on Elise. Moreover, he took pride in standing by his choices. Elise stepped closer to thank him for protecting her, and he apologized because he had nearly forced her to become the soul killer. Suddenly, a presence emerged from afar and fired at Elise. Kento shouted her name just in time to warn her. What appeared was a group of goblins, and Elise questioned how such monsters could be there. During her investigations, she had only encountered humanoid golems. Kento remarked that since this was also his first time seeing them, this dungeon likely wasn't the one that had produced them. Elise concluded that if they weren't from this island, then another dungeon must have appeared on the mainland. As she prepared to release an arrow, Kento stepped forward and shielded her from an incoming attack. A goblin charged at him repeatedly, and Kento realized this had to be another scheme orchestrated by the government woman. Elise urged him to stay calm. There were too many goblins for the two of them to fight off alone. She fired her arrows to slay the monsters, and little by little, they managed to wipe out the group. Kento remarked that their victory felt almost disappointing, which struck Alice as odd, especially since the body of one goblin had not vanished. Clearly, something was wrong. Meanwhile, the assistant received a call and responded that she would take care of some matters to address the situation, promising to report back soon. She smiled when her superior appeared, asking what had occurred on the island. The assistant explained that she had just received the report and would be heading out to verify some details. At the same time, Alice discovered that the government woman had been dismissed from her position. It appeared that the secretary was preparing something new, meaning a replacement committee member would now handle the matter. Alice hoped they would not cause further problems. Before long, they were visited once more. This time, the assistant, Shimizu, arrived and apologized for the incident the other day. She assured them she was still authorized to participate as secretary and encouraged them to reach out as needed. She also introduced the new intermediary taking over the previous advisor's role in the case. Her name was Nanami. Kento greeted Nanami and asked about the procedures, wondering if she referred to the discussions about handing over the island. Nanami promptly denied it, clarifying that it was merely one of the many crimes the former advisor had committed. They apologized for dragging the two into it, but their objective this time was entirely different. Since the government had learned about the dungeon's existence on this island, they had been demanding something like administrative authority and access to the site. Based on that, Nanami asked if they would at least hear out the request. If possible, they also wished to find a way to be forgiven, particularly for the misconduct of their former officials. In response, Kento asked if she would be willing to grant Japanese citizenship to Alice. If she truly intended to advance her dungeon plans, it would be wise to clearly establish the status that people from other worlds would hold in society. As she had already heard, a dungeon had also appeared in Shinjuku, where they discovered another individual from another world now under government protection. This could serve as the perfect opportunity to clearly define the status of people from other worlds in such situations. Suddenly, Alice asked if it was true that others had also arrived in this world, and Nanami confirmed it, explaining that they were found wandering the city before being taken into custody. They wanted to finalize the process and draw conclusions about the circumstances and information related to how these individuals crossed over. Nanami then asked if Alice wanted to meet them, noting that if so, negotiations would be necessary. Nanami also agreed to prioritize the issue of citizenship, which left Kento pleasantly surprised by her sudden generosity. Shifting the topic, he asked about their demands, and Nanami reassured him that there was no need to be fearful. Since the government aimed to establish facilities for researching monsters and magical stones, they were requesting joint management of the island. They could offer financial aid and special privileges, leading Kento to ask if that meant more people would be coming to the island. Nanami admitted she could not deny that and questioned whether it would not be the best way to minimize the impact. Still, Alice could not understand. Sharing management of the island essentially meant a government occupation of the land. She wondered where anyone would find a fool willing to willingly invite a military force that would later be used against them. Kento explained that their idea was to operate the dungeon's management and administration like a business. This would not only raise awareness of the dungeon but also allow research on magic, with access granted to those meeting requirements. They could establish a contract with the government for producing magical stones and their derivatives. Through this, both sides could benefit from the arrangement. Nanami pointed out that this would inevitably create the need for a research unit to be set up on the island. They could not allow people from another world to freely share valuable knowledge without limitations. In addition to research facilities, a team would be required to oversee them, and the protagonist realized this would not be easily solved. If that were the case, Kento said he wanted to ask something, specifically when the government had started creating monsters. Nanami replied that it was around the time when the former advisor deployed her troops. They too were attacked by goblins that had not come from the dungeon. This caused Shimizu to glare at Nanami, but she continued, saying that when each one died, only a single corpse remained. Alai then explained that when a dungeon monster mixed with an outside creature, the offspring left behind corpses like any other living being. Furthermore, The only beings capable of reproducing with goblins were humans, either through assault or reproduction. Nanami became flustered by the thought, while Alai laughed at how improper the topic seemed for her. That was precisely why the government's dungeon management was inadequate. In any case, having an agent propose such matters right after everything that had happened could hardly be seen as coincidence. These events, combined with the government's demand for management rights, only made the truth clearer. Kento asked if this could be interpreted as proof that the government simply lacked knowledge. If they truly knew nothing about the goblins, then visiting to observe these procedures was practically meaningless. If they were somehow involved, however, it might be an attempt to keep information from leaking. If that was their aim, they would return the goblin's corpse to them. Should they agree to the terms, Nanami said she would take the matter back for deliberation. Everything was left in her hands, though she offered heartfelt apologies, which Kento accepted with a smile. He added that since the corpse was still fresh, he hoped she could provide a response soon, and Nanami agreed. Yet after leaving, Nanami shouted angrily that because of the former advisor, they had even uncovered the goblins. Her assistant urged her to calm down, but Nanami complained that the negotiations could not proceed as they were. If they had acted sooner, they would not be burdened with such a ridiculous task. She declared that the next time things became incomprehensible, she would leave the negotiations to her assistant. From afar, Alai saw the two women talking and Kento laughed, feeling a little sorry for them. Alai then remarked that since Nanami had accepted the terms, they might as well take advantage of her as much as possible. The protagonist asked if she was not excited about the chance to see her friends again. Alai answered that she was unsure. Back when she had just arrived in this world, perhaps she would have been excited. But now, she felt she would rather not disrupt the peaceful, quiet life they had built together. Kento smiled, agreeing that it was indeed a strange thought. Later, elsewhere, some people were conversing, one asking if the elf who had spoken earlier was living on another island. Even in another world, it seemed, elves preferred to remain hidden. Perhaps it would be better for everyone if they refrained from sarcasm. Moreover, she wasn't just any elf, she was Alai's. At the very least, people should remember her name, but the other person responded that it wasn't necessary. At that moment, Nanami informed the two that they were nearly at their destination and told them to get ready to disembark. She advised them not to provoke the other side unnecessarily, as this was an important meeting and she didn't want things to get complicated. Kento then greeted Nanami as usual, apologizing for inviting her so many times since then. Nanami answered that it was fine, as visiting the protagonist's home was part of her duties anyway. He inquired about the other world, and Nanami confirmed that she had brought them along. One of them suddenly called out Alai's name, and the elf recognized Mina, surprising Nanami because it seemed the two already knew one another. Alai explained that they had once belonged to the same group in their original world, and Nanami remarked that this would make the discussion smoother. Another person approached, commenting about the elf he had heard of, saying that choosing such a place to hide was typical for an elf. Alai greeted the dwarf, though it didn't seem like they were particularly pleased to see each other. Kento asked them not to stand around talking and suggested they go inside to continue the conversation in a calmer setting. He then brought up what Nanami had mentioned earlier, introducing himself to the two as the owner of the island. Alai also introduced herself, saying that she had been a hunter before coming to this world. Since Mina had once been in the same group as Alai, there was no need to explain further to her. Mina introduced herself as well, followed by the dwarf Wilhelm, who explained that he had met her in another group after Alai had disappeared. The elf asked Wilhelm whether he was part of the guild, and Mina confirmed it, curious about Alai's question. Alai explained that she had joined the guild as a hunter but had stood out significantly because she was an elf among humans. Surely, people must have noticed her presence. Wilhelm replied that he had originally been an armorer and didn't really care much about hunters. Then the elf asked why the dwarf had ended up joining the Hunters Guild, and from his reaction, she realized that he must have had his own share of struggles. Wilhelm muttered that he was burdened by debt, and at that point Nanami shifted the topic because there were other matters to address. Alai agreed and suggested they begin discussing the circumstances that had led them to be sent to this world. She explained that she had been part of a group whose goal was to reach the deepest floor of a dungeon. The further down they went, the stronger the monsters they faced became. Even so, they somehow managed to reach the very bottom, where they found a small chamber that contained only tiny crystalline objects. Just before touching them, she felt her consciousness weaken, and when Elise came to, she had collapsed and woken up on one of the beaches of the island. Elise then asked Mina what she had done afterward, and Mina explained that they had carried out a search looking for the elf but never found her. The rest of the members decided it would be better to return to the surface, and before long, the group eventually disbanded. Mina later joined another team, where she met Wilhelm, and together they once again descended with others to the dungeon's lowest floor. There, they came across the same crystalline objects they had seen before, and Wilhelm continued the tale from where Mina had left off. He explained that, just like Elise had described, they closed their eyes for a moment, and when they opened them again, they had ended up in Tokyo. Elise asked whether that had happened without even touching the object, and whether it was in a different dungeon than the one where she had been transported. Mina answered that she didn't know. All she remembered was that, before losing consciousness, she thought of Elise. The elf asked whether they believed this could be connected to the reason she had been transported to this world as well, but it was difficult to prove such a claim. Kento could see the connection. It seemed they shared similar plans to explore the dungeon on the island. Therefore, they needed to decide on what to do next. In fact, there were already plans to establish a business specifically aimed at managing the dungeon. On that subject, they considered asking the two for their cooperation and knowledge. Mina was expected to conduct research and work on potion development. Meanwhile, Wilhelm was being considered for a position on the government's team of researchers to work on developing magical tools. Without hesitation, Wilhelm accepted, as he now had the chance to craft weapons again, and so he saw no reason to decline. Mina also agreed, saying that she would be part of their group. Although she wasn't certain she could live up to their expectations, she promised to do her best. Nanami understood and said that from that day forward, they could stay there. She had already anticipated that this would be the outcome. For that reason, she had brought along some items she believed would be useful and had also handled the necessary bureaucratic arrangements. Wilhelm was surprised that moving had been considered one of the conditions, while Mina remarked that she had intended to relocate to where Elise was living from the very beginning. So, nothing really changed, and Kento confirmed that they could all share the available rooms until proper facilities were completed. Nanami mentioned that she needed to report back and would be returning to Tokyo. She also said she would arrange for their belongings to be delivered. She promised to get in touch once the government made its decision on the next steps. With that, she said her farewells and left everything in their care. Elise felt as if all the responsibility had been dumped on them, and Kento agreed with that impression. They now needed to show the island to Mina and Wilhelm as well, which kept them quite occupied. Afterward, the development of the island truly began to progress. The secretary had now taken on the role of government representative and started living there on the island. With the research facilities under construction, they also began paving roads, which greatly transformed the scenery. Elise felt that the atmosphere of the place was changing significantly, while Kento smiled, recalling the time when they had visited the mainland. Their lives on the island were about to change dramatically with the influx of new people, and Kento admitted it was true. Still, despite how much the island might change, the memories the two of them had created would always remain, which almost felt like a cliché confession. No matter the changes, his wish to protect life there stayed the same, and Elise laughed in agreement, clearly pleased to hear him say that. The protagonist felt excited to see how the island would continue to develop and to discover more about the other world. After all, it felt as though they were gradually growing closer. He thought that life on the island would become easier and might help them build that shared future together, which made the two of them lock eyes in silence. Just as a special moment seemed about to unfold and Elise leaned toward Kento, Mina suddenly appeared, calling out the protagonist's name. She came to report that her assigned task had been completed, and the protagonist agreed. It was time to return, though Elise felt frustrated since she had been so close to getting what she wanted. Later, Kento reflected that it was finally time for Japan to have its own dungeon explorers now that events had progressed this far. He asked everyone to keep in mind the safety of the adventurers as well as any problems that might occur inside the dungeons. The assistant agreed, and Kento went on, saying that, as they had discussed earlier, the security of the entrance gate's office would be left to Ayako and Akamine, 2 hired workers. Ayako promised that she would do her best to meet Director Shimizu's expectations so that things would be managed properly. Akamine also agreed, saying he would do what he could. With that settled, they decided to head to the dungeon together with Yumizu, the assistant, and then they departed from the island, leaving Kento behind. When everyone had gone, the protagonist let out a sigh of relief. For the first time in days, he was finally alone, if only for a short while. Meanwhile, elsewhere, someone was searching for a girl while holding a cell phone, having recognized her from a photograph.